Just take Grandma's savings, he said, like he was suggesting they move a lamp or cancel a streaming service, his voice low but not low enough, because I was standing right there at the sink, with my hands in the dishwater and my back turned, rinsing the plates I'd bought in the kitchen I'd helped pay for. In the house my husband never lived to see, but whose down payment came straight out of the account we'd built together over 43 years of waking up before the alarm and saying, "One more day, Marta, we're getting there." I didn't drop the plate. I didn't gasp or whirl around or create a scene like the unhinged elderly woman I suppose I am in their heads when they whisper about cognitive decline and what if something happens? I just rinsed the plate in slow circles and listened, the way old women listen when they've learned that the worst blows always arrive sounding practical. "She doesn't even check her statements," Jenna replied, soft and efficient, the same tone she uses when she says, "We'll take care of you, and don't you worry about the bills, and you just relax," as if relaxation is a kindness and not a way of keeping someone seated, quiet, out of the room where decisions are made. "She has that old CD from before Dad died. It's just sitting there," my son added, and I knew exactly which one he meant, the one Arturo and I had renewed instead of taking a trip because Mark was buying his first condo. And it's just for stability. "Mom, we don't want to be stretched." And we smiled and said, "Of course, mijo, of course. That's what parents are for." I stood there with the sponge in my hand and watched a soap bubble slide slowly down the curve of a glass. And I thought, that's how it happens. Not with a gun to your head or a forged signature under flickering neon, but with a murmur over the kitchen island. You wiped that morning while you hummed and wondered if they liked the lasagna. A murmur that measures your worth in what can be accessed. I'm 79, and I live alone now in a small apartment with thin walls and honest light. But that morning, I was still in their house, sleeping in the room that used to be called the study, until it became Grandma's room, like a guest room that had overstayed its welcome, and I was still the woman who folded their laundry just to feel useful, who slipped 20s into her granddaughter's backpack, who refilled the sugar jar, who tried not to see the way Jenna moved my mug to the far side of the counter like it didn't match her set. The radio was on low. Some forgettable song about endless love sung by someone who's probably already divorced. And the baby monitor buzzed on the table, and Jenna's bracelets clicked as she scrolled on her phone. "I'm just saying," Mark continued, and now his voice had that strained patience he uses when he thinks he's being the only adult in the room. "We could consolidate, get ahead of the credit cards. She doesn't need all that sitting there. We're taking care of her, aren't we?" And Jenna said, "Exactly. She's got food, a roof. We drive her to appointments. It's not like she's out on the street. If we don't use it, it'll just go to taxes or nursing homes." And then, for emphasis, as if she were the reasonable one in a courtroom where I was not invited, "It's not stealing if it's family." My hands were pruning in the water. The dish in my fingers felt heavier, like the weight of those words had seeped into the porcelain. I turned off the tap. I still didn't look at them, but my hearing has never been better in my life than it was in that silence that came after. Jenna said, "It's not stealing." That's the thing about being my age. People assume everything about you is fading at once. Your eyes, your ears, your judgment, like someone dimming a house for the night, room by room. What really happens is different. Certain senses go soft, yes, but others sharpen like a knife finally being used for its real purpose. They thought I wasn't listening. They thought I wouldn't understand words like transfer and beneficiary and online banking access. They think because I sometimes write my grocery list in big letters, I don't remember account numbers I repeated in my head on buses at dawn all through the 80s. Praying checks wouldn't bounce before payday. "We'll just talk to the bank," Mark said. And the casualness in that "just" made the back of my neck go cold. "We can say it's for her care. They're used to that. They expect it. They expect it. Of course they do. Banks expect old people to be handled, processed, smoothed out by younger hands that sign for them and speak for them and siphon their choices away under the slogan of security." I took a breath, long and quiet, and made my shoulders relax. Because that is another thing you learn. Never let the predator see you've heard the twig snap. "Coffee's getting cold," I said, turning around at last, smiling the way mothers smile when they know more than their children think. Mark looked up like he'd forgotten I existed. That was the worst part. He didn't jump or blush or stammer a denial. He just said, "Hey, Mom," with that absent warmth you give a familiar chair. Jenna flashed the smile she saves for other women's mothers and said, "Oh, you didn't have to do the dishes," like I had committed a small social violation by cleaning in my own kitchen. "Keeps my hands busy," I answered, drying them slowly on a towel, my eyes drifting, just once, to the corner of the counter where my purse sat. Closed, the worn strap looped over the back of the chair, looking suddenly like a throat. There was a faint pink lipstick stain on my mug from yesterday. I wiped it off. My heart was not racing. I wish I could say it was. That would sound more flattering, like a young woman's reaction. No, my heart slowed down, as if saving its beats for what mattered. "We were actually going to talk to you about simplifying some things," Mark said, pulling out a bar stool and sitting like a man about to negotiate a cable bill. And Jenna drifted closer, smelling of expensive soap and entitlement. "Bills, passwords, that stuff, you don't need to stress about it," he went on. "I'm happy to take it off your plate." He reached for my mug like he owned gravity in this room. I moved it away with a small, steady motion. "My plate is fine," I said, and he laughed like I'd told a joke that didn't quite land. "You know what I mean, Mom. Nowadays, it's all online. People your age get targeted all the time, scams everywhere. Best if I help manage things, prevent mistakes." The word mistakes hung there between us. He meant mine. I looked at my son, at the trace of baby fat still ghosting his cheeks if I softened my gaze, at the hands that once reached for mine, crossing streets, now tapping a rhythm of impatience on the marble island I had funded. I thought of the night he called after Arturo's funeral, his voice shaking, saying, "Mom, this is the one. 3 bedrooms, schools are good. We're just a little short." And how proud I'd been that he wanted to build a life. How ready I was to help. No one in that conversation had used words like asset or leverage or access. It had been about family. "We can sit down later," Jenna added, slipping seamlessly into her role as facilitator. I printed some things to sign, just little forms, giving Mark authority so if anything happens, we're covered. It's really for your own peace of mind. She's so good, that girl. I almost admired it in that moment. How every blade she held came padded with cotton. "We'll see," I said, and rinsed my hands again, though they were already clean. I glanced at the clock. 8:47 a.m. I remember the numbers because they felt like coordinates. I remember the tint of the light on the countertop, pale and filtered through their tailored curtains. I remember the tiniest smear of tomato sauce under the stove handle from last night's dinner that no one but me would notice. People think the grand betrayals are remembered in thunderclaps, but it's always the small, out-of-place details that freeze in you. I went back to my room. My room. That guest cell with the neutral quilt and the framed abstract print that looked like someone had tried to erase a sunset. And I closed the door. I didn't lock it. Locks here were symbolic. The real doors had been closing in other ways for months. Conversations cut short when I entered, mail already opened on the hall table, jokes about Mom and her old-school bank book, Jenna suggesting I sell my car. Because you hardly drive, Mark mentioning a great assisted place near them, said lightly, like the weather. I sat on the edge of the bed and took my purse into my lap and unzipped it. The bank card was there. The same one I'd signed with a firm hand years ago. The savings had a number in it that wasn't enormous, not compared to what men talk about over golf, but it was carved out of years of staying late, of making do, of putting off new shoes, of patching Arturo's shirts, of saying, next year, we'll travel, and then never quite making it. It was a promise fund, a just-in-case fund, a we-made-it-this-far fund. Apparently, in my son's mind, it had quietly become community property, a reservoir for his overspending and Jenna's taste for coordinated everything. I ran my thumb over the raised numbers. You ask if I was hurt. Of course I was. But hurt is not the word that sat in my chest just then. What I felt was recognition. Not the first time in my life a man I'd loved had decided that what was mine was available, that my work, my body, my time, my money could be absorbed into a need larger than my own, and that gratitude was the only payment expected from me. The difference now was that this time I had the script in my hands early enough to choose a different ending. Simplify, I whispered, hearing Mark's new favorite word. Fine. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and checked my reflection in the small mirror screwed into the wall. Old? Yes. Gray hair pulled back neatly, soft skin mapped with every storm I'd walked through. But my eyes were clear, clearer than his had been downstairs. I picked up my cardigan, slid my card and ID deep into the inside pocket, zipped my purse, and slipped on my shoes. From the doorway, the hallway looked longer than usual, like something in the house knew I was about to break choreography. I walked past the nursery with its expensive wallpaper and its white noise murmur, past the little framed sign that said, "This house runs on love and coffee," and I almost laughed. On the console table lay the stack of printed forms Jenna had mentioned: durable power of attorney, medical proxy, joint account authorization. Efficient, ready, waiting for my shaky hand. I didn't touch them. Going for a walk, I called lightly toward the kitchen, where I could hear Jenna's voice and the soft thud of Mark opening cabinets like every hinge owed him an apology. Need anything? I added, like the good mother, the helpful presence. No, Mom, we're good, he said, distracted, something clinking in the fridge. Of course you are, I thought, opening the front door, feeling the cool morning air brush my cheeks in a way that felt indecently intimate, like freedom. I stepped outside with my purse on my shoulder, my savings in my pocket, and their voices fading behind me, still talking about my future as if I weren't already walking toward it. The bank was only 6 blocks away, a modest brick building with faded flags out front and a row of geraniums that someone watered too enthusiastically, leaving small puddles that caught the morning light like little mirrors. I walked slowly, my shoes making that uneven tapping sound older soles do on concrete. But I felt no ache in my knees. My body seemed to understand before my mind did that I was going somewhere decisive, not just running an errand. The autumn air smelled faintly of diesel and cut grass, the kind of morning smell that used to mean paydays, grocery lists, errands with purpose. Now it carried something else, an edge, a quiet determination that frightened and thrilled me in equal measure. I passed the bakery where Jenna bought croissants on Sundays, the yoga studio where she said the instructors were transformational, the boutique that sold sweaters costing more than my monthly pension check. Each window reflected my face as I went by, a different version of me framed by someone else's luxury. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't look away. When I reached the crosswalk, the traffic light blinked its slow red hand, and I waited with a patience that wasn't patience at all. It was calculation. It was time measured for clarity. I replayed the morning in my head, every word, every tone, every casual cruelty dressed in concern. We can manage it for her. It's not stealing if it's family. The phrases repeated like an old hymn, stripped of melody. Inside the bank, the air was cool, the hum of fluorescent lights steady like the pulse of a nervous system. The same teller had been there for years, a young woman once who had become, like everyone in this town, older without my noticing. Her name tag said Allison. She smiled automatically when she saw me, that practiced professional warmth that makes you feel like a customer, but never a person. "Good morning, Mrs. Calderon," she said. "Here to make a deposit." For a moment, I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. How many years had I walked into places like this to deposit pieces of myself? Overtime hours, saved receipts, pennies, and promises. "Actually," I said, "I'm here to make a withdrawal." My voice surprised me with its steadiness. A full withdrawal. Her eyebrows lifted. "Of which account?" "The savings," I said. "The one under Martha E. Calderon." She clicked at her keyboard, eyes scanning the screen, lips pursed with the kind of polite skepticism usually reserved for people who have forgotten their own date of birth. "You understand," she began carefully, "that closing an account of that size will—" "I understand," I interrupted softly, not unkindly. "Please proceed." She hesitated, fingers hovering. "Do you need to speak with our financial advisor first? Sometimes people your age prefer—" She caught herself too late. I smiled. Not the sweet grandmother smile she expected, but the older, sharper kind, the one forged from decades of being underestimated. "My age," I said, "has nothing to do with my arithmetic." Her cheeks flushed. She nodded, murmured something about policy, and disappeared into the back office. While I waited, I sat on the small blue chair by the potted ficus, the kind that only thrives under artificial light. Through the glass doors I could see people passing outside. Hurried, sleek, young. None of them looked like me, which was precisely why I belonged here more than they did. I had earned every dollar that was about to become mine again. When Allison returned, she was accompanied by a man in a navy suit, whose tie was the color of expensive indifference. "Mrs. Calderon," he said, offering a hand. "I'm Mr. Schultz, the branch manager." "I just wanted to confirm you're aware of what closing this account entails." "I am," I said, shaking his hand. "It entails closing it." He smiled like someone told to be gentle with a skittish pet. "It's just that, well, this account has been active for over 30 years. It's unusual to—" "I was married to the same man for 42, I said evenly. I've done unusual things before. The corner of his mouth twitched, but he didn't argue. Very well. Will you be needing the funds in cash? Partially, I replied. Half in a cashier's check made out to me, half in cash. He blinked, recalculating whatever quiet algorithm decided which customers required oversight. We can do that. It may take a few minutes. Take your time, I said, and meant it. The sound of the printer spitting forms filled the quiet space between us. As I signed, the pen felt heavier than any pen had a right to be. The paper smelled faintly of toner and consequence. My name looked strange in that crisp black ink, Martha E. Calderon. Formal, detached, but alive again, like something retrieved from a locked drawer. Schultz gathered the papers, nodded approvingly, and handed me a crisp envelope. Inside were two things: the cashier's check, folded once, and a stack of $100 bills, thick and startlingly clean. I'd forgotten that money could have a smell, dry, papery, almost metallic, like the inside of an old hope chest. I slid them into my purse carefully, not as loot, but as proof. When I stepped outside, the sunlight hit me with the clarity of an interrogation lamp. The world seemed absurdly bright, as if every surface wanted to confirm I'd done something irreversible. I stood for a moment under the awning, breathing. A young man in headphones brushed past me, muttering an apology. I smiled at his retreating back and thought, "You have no idea, son, what freedom smells like at 79. I walked down the street slowly, my pulse steady, the envelope pressing a faint shape against the fabric of my bag. Each step felt like a signature. When I reached the corner, I didn't turn toward the bus stop that would take me home. I turned in the opposite direction, toward the lawyer's office where Arturo and I had once drawn up our wills. The same brass plaque gleamed beside the door. Inside, a new receptionist, bright and perfumed, looked up with the startled politeness of someone who hasn't yet learned to disguise surprise at old age. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I imagine someone can make time for me. It's a small matter of ownership." They made time. The young lawyer who eventually appeared looked barely older than my grandson. His tie was crooked. I liked him instantly. "Mrs. Calderon," he said, "how can I help?" I laid the cashier's check on the desk between us and explained calmly that I wanted to draft a new will, one that placed my son nowhere near the word executor. I spoke slowly, clearly, listing what I owned, what I had left, and what I intended to protect. He nodded, taking notes, occasionally glancing up with something like admiration, or maybe just surprise that I wasn't confused, weepy, or docile. "You're very thorough," he said. "Age makes you thorough," I replied. "You stop trusting summaries." When I left an hour later, my copy of the draft folded neatly in my purse beside the envelope of cash, I felt lighter, but also anchored, like a ship that has finally chosen its own harbor. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered along the sidewalk like whispers trying to keep up. I passed a small cafe and paused, tempted by the smell of coffee that reminded me of mornings before everything became delicate negotiations. I went in and ordered a cappuccino, ignoring the barista's gentle condescension as he asked if I wanted extra foam, ma'am. I took a seat by the window, sipped slowly, and opened my purse just enough to look at the edge of the envelope. Reassuring. Myself, it was real. Around me, conversations hummed, people talking about promotions, renovations, diets. No one noticed me, and for once, that invisibility felt like armor, instead of erasure. I thought of Mark at that moment, perhaps checking his phone, confident he had time, that his mother's world moved at half speed. He had no idea that by the time he poured his second coffee, the balance he'd counted on was gone, the access revoked, the narrative rewritten. I left the cafe and walked toward the park. Children shouted from swings, their laughter jagged and bright. I sat on a bench and watched the ducks glide on the pond's surface, thinking how easily they looked content, how little they seemed to question the water's depth. I envied that once, but not now, because now I understood that peace is not given, it's reclaimed. The betrayal this morning had been swift, but its preparation had been long. Years of small dismissals, of my expertise politely ignored, of my independence quietly replaced with managed affection. The money, I realized, was only a symbol. The real theft had been happening in increments. Every time they told me, "We'll handle it." Every time I said thank you instead of no. The sun had climbed higher, warming my shoulders through the thin cardigan. I stayed there until noon, letting the noise of the park blend into something like courage. When I finally stood, I knew I couldn't go back to their house pretending ignorance. I walked to the payphone by the park entrance. Yes, one still existed, and called a cab. The driver was a woman with tired eyes and a radio tuned to soft jazz. "Where to?" she asked. "Home," I said, then added after a beat, "For now." The ride was short, but it gave me time to plan. I would pack quietly. I would take only what was mine, and when they noticed, it would already be done. Betrayal, after all, is only complete when silence follows. I had no intention of giving them silence anymore. I would give them absence instead. When the cab stopped in front of the house, the air had shifted. The late afternoon light had turned the windows into squares of amber that made everything inside look softer than it was. I sat there a moment, letting the meter tick while I rehearsed calmness. The driver asked if I wanted her to wait, and I said no, my voice so steady it surprised even me. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked up the path. Through the kitchen window I could see Jenna moving about, a glass of white wine in her hand, phone pressed to her ear. Her laughter rose and fell like a line she had practiced. It was the sound of a woman performing ease. For a second I thought of turning around and walking until night fell. But dignity still lived somewhere in me, a small creature that refused to scurry away unseen. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could. The smell of garlic and lemon drifted through the air, dinner in progress, every motion efficient, curated. "Mom? That you?" Mark called from the living room, his voice stretched thin with distraction. "Yes, dear," I said, setting my purse on the console table, keeping one hand on it. "We were just talking about you," Jenna said, appearing in the doorway, her smile bright enough to cut glass. "You've been gone for hours." I was starting to worry. She looked at the clock on the microwave, as if to remind me of the scale of my absence, and then back at me. "Everything okay?" "Perfectly," I said. "I took care of some errands." The word errands seemed to please her. It fit her narrative of me as harmless, domestic, looping quietly in small circles of routine. Mark turned down the television volume but didn't stand up. "We were going to go over those forms after dinner," he said. "The power of attorney stuff. I think it'll just make things easier for everyone." "Of course," I said, taking off my cardigan and folding it neatly on the back of a chair. "Dinner smells wonderful." Jenna visibly relaxed, the way people do when they think the crisis they sensed has passed. She returned to the kitchen, humming tunelessly, and I followed, not to help but to observe. On the counter, beside the cutting board, lay the stack of documents again, the same ones I had passed that morning. They were now clipped together with a pen placed diagonally across the top, an invitation disguised as efficiency. "You can look them over while I finish the sauce," she said lightly. "Just a formality, really." I nodded, but instead of touching them, I picked up the salt shaker and began seasoning the pan where the chicken simmered. The rhythm of it, the soft hiss, the smell of rosemary, took me back to kitchens that belonged to me, not to borrowed spaces where I was tolerated. "Careful," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I already added salt." "Then it's perfect," I replied, setting the shaker down. When we sat for dinner, the three of us performed our roles. The baby slept upstairs, the television murmured faintly in another room, and the silverware clinked in precise intervals. Mark talked about work, new clients, budgets, words that had nothing to do with love. Jenna nodded at the right moments, sipping her wine, glancing at me occasionally with the stiff politeness one gives to an elderly neighbor. "So, Mom," she began after a pause, long enough to suggest calculation. "About the bank stuff. Did you ever find that PIN number? We should really set up those automatic payments." I looked up from my plate. "I handled everything today," I said. Mark frowned slightly. "Handled what?" "My finances." I smiled and reached for my water. "Everything's settled." The pause that followed was almost theatrical. Jenna's fork hovered midair. "Settled?" "Yes," I said. "All organized. Nothing to worry about." Mark set his napkin down. "You didn't move anything without talking to me, did you?" His tone had changed, the warmth evaporating like water on a hot pan. "I'm not sure why I would talk to you about my accounts," I said gently. "They're mine." He stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. "That's not the point," he said, his voice rising despite himself. "You know banks can get things wrong. You should have let me handle it. You don't even check the statements half the time." "And yet," I said, "everything seems perfectly in order." I took another bite, calm and deliberate, even though my hands had begun to tremble under the table. Jenna intervened with her trained diplomacy. "Mark, I'm sure your mom knows what she's doing," she said, smiling too widely. "Let's not make this into a thing." But her eyes flicked toward my purse by the door, as if it contained the answer to a question she wasn't brave enough to ask. After dinner, I helped clear the table, the old reflex too deeply ingrained to break immediately. While Jenna washed dishes, I folded the napkins and listened to the murmur of their voices from the living room. "She's being strange," Mark said, low but not low enough. "You think she closed it?" "She wouldn't," Jenna replied. "She's just confused." "No," he said, "she's not confused. She's pissed." There was something satisfying in hearing him finally name an emotion, even if he misdiagnosed the target. I finished stacking the plates, wiped my hands, and went upstairs. The house felt different, as if every polished surface was suddenly watching. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my purse, and looked at the envelope again. Still there. The faint smell of paper and ink. Proof of autonomy. I slid it back inside and began to pack. I started with small things. Photographs, the framed one of Arturo and me in front of the old house, the pearl earrings he'd given me on our 30th anniversary, my medications, a sweater, a pair of shoes that didn't pinch. Each item folded into the suitcase felt like a line crossed out in an old ledger. I moved slowly, not from indecision, but from reverence for final acts. Below the hum of the air conditioning, I could hear footsteps downstairs, quick, restless. When the door creaked open, I didn't flinch. "Mom?" Mark's voice carried that forced casualness of a man entering enemy territory. "You up?" "Just packing," I said. He stepped into the doorway, hands on his hips, the posture of authority borrowed from his job, not earned here. "Packing? For what?" "For moving," I said simply. "You're joking." "I never joke about logistics." He blinked, searching my face for weakness, for a crack of uncertainty he could pour his reason into. "You're overreacting. Whatever you think you heard." "I heard enough," I said, "and you were right. I don't need to worry about it anymore." Jenna appeared behind him, her face carefully composed. "Let's just talk this through," she said, as though there was a management seminar for this. "There's no need for drama." "Drama," I repeated, tasting the word. "That's when people pretend to feel. This is something else." Mark stepped closer. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Do you even know what closing that account does for your taxes? For your estate planning?" I looked at him for a long time. "Do you know what pretending your mother doesn't understand arithmetic does to your soul?" He stared, and for once had no answer ready. Jenna's eyes darted between us, and for a flicker of a second, I saw fear, real fear, there. Not of me, but of the collapse of the quiet order she had curated. "We love you," she said suddenly, too brightly. "This is just a misunderstanding." "Love," I said softly, "doesn't whisper in kitchens about taking what isn't offered." I zipped the suitcase. The sound was final, small but absolute, like the lid of a coffin sliding into place. Downstairs, I could hear the baby waking, a small wail slicing through the tense air. Jenna turned instinctively, mother before strategist. Mark stayed. "Where are you even going?" he asked. "You don't have anywhere else." That was the moment I realized how completely he had rewritten me in his mind. Not as the woman who had built, worked, sustained, but as a dependent orbiting his son. "I'll find somewhere," I said. "I've lived before you, remember." He opened his mouth, closed it, then exhaled through his nose like a man conceding a point he couldn't afford to lose. "This isn't necessary," he said again, softer now, almost pleading. "It's all a misunderstanding." "It's a lesson," I replied, lifting the suitcase. "For both of us." I walked past him, down the stairs, each step heavy with decades of habit breaking loose. Jenna stood at the bottom holding the baby, who blinked at me with wide, unjudging eyes. "You can't just leave," she said. "You don't even drive anymore." "Then I'll walk," I said. "There's always a cab." I reached for my coat on the hook, the familiar fabric grounding me. "Please," Mark said, following. "Let's just talk tomorrow. Sleep on it." "Tomorrow," I said, "I'll be gone." Outside, the evening had cooled. The sky hung low with the first hint of rain, the air heavy with it. I stood on the porch for a long moment, breathing in the scent of the wet earth. Behind me, through the window, I could see them standing together, silhouettes framed by the light I had once paid to keep burning. Jenna rocked the baby. Mark stood with his hands on his head, staring at nothing. I stepped off the porch, the gravel soft under my feet, and started walking toward the main road. The streetlights flickered on one by one, indifferent witnesses to small revolutions. When I reached the corner, I looked back once, Not at the house, but at the upstairs window of my room. The curtain fluttered slightly in the breeze like a wave goodbye or a sigh of relief. Then I kept walking. I didn't cry. I didn't stumble. I didn't feel triumphant either. What I felt was clean. The kind of clean that comes after scrubbing a floor for hours when you know the dirt will come back eventually, but for now, it's gone. At the intersection, a car slowed beside me, the driver an older man with kind eyes. "Need a ride, ma'am?" he asked. "Just to the bus station," I said, and he nodded. As the car pulled away, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just another shadow among shadows. I thought of all the years I had spent making that place a home for someone else's comfort, how easily they'd turned it into a museum of my obsolescence. The rain began to fall lightly, streaking the window beside me. Each drop seemed to erase another illusion. By the time we reached the station, the sky had opened completely, a steady cleansing. I paid the driver, stepped into the wet evening, and felt, for the first time in years, unaccounted for. The next morning began in a quiet so sharp it felt almost artificial, as if the world itself were holding its breath to see whether I would falter. The apartment I'd rented, a temporary one-bedroom above a small grocery store, smelled of fresh paint and lemon cleaning spray. The floorboards creaked when I walked, an honest sound, not the muffled hush of carpets meant to hide discontent. I had arrived late the night before, wet from the rain, carrying only the suitcase, my purse, and the dull exhaustion of a woman who had just stepped out of her own life. The landlord, a retired nurse named Ava, had left a note on the table welcoming me and reminding me that the rent was due on the 5th. Her handwriting was large and clear, without apology. I sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that morning and realized, almost with surprise, that no one knew where I was. Mark had no address, no key, no authority left to reach in and rearrange what belonged to me. The realization didn't bring joy, not yet. It brought stillness, the kind that sits in your bones when you're about to make sense of chaos. Through the window, I could see the street below waking up, the baker unlocking his shop, a man in a navy cap sweeping the sidewalk, a group of children dragging their backpacks to school. I thought of my granddaughter then, probably still asleep, her curls tangled, her small hand curled around the stuffed rabbit I'd bought her. The image ached in me, not because I missed her, but because I could already hear Jenna's voice explaining my disappearance in that tone of calm deceit she'd mastered. "Grandma needed some rest," she'd say. "She's a bit confused lately." And the child would nod, absorbing that story as truth, adding it to the growing file of falsehoods she'd one day have to unlearn. That was when I understood that leaving wasn't the end of something. It was only the start of the counter-story, the one I needed to tell before they sealed me inside their version. I spent that morning taking stock. I laid out every item I owned on the bed, an inventory of survival disguised as domestic order. 2 skirts, 3 blouses, a cardigan, my husband's old watch, the pearls, a folder with documents from the lawyer, and the envelope of cash, now slightly wrinkled from the journey. I counted it again, not because I doubted the number, but because the act itself was grounding. Each bill was proof that I existed outside of anyone's permission. When I finished, I placed the envelope in a tin cookie box I found in one of the cupboards and slid it under the bed. I told myself that tomorrow I'd open a new account at a different bank under my new address. But for now, I wanted to feel the physical weight of security nearby. The grocery store downstairs opened at 9. I went down for bread and milk, and the young clerk, a boy who couldn't have been older than 20, greeted me with that bright, impersonal politeness people reserve for customers they'll forget in 5 minutes. Still, there was comfort in being no one to him. I bought a newspaper too. The front page was about a local election, the kind of news that fills space between wars. I read it in the park across the street, feeding the pigeons pieces of crust, feeling the morning settle into its rhythm. For a brief moment, I almost convinced myself that normalcy could be rebuilt this easily, one ordinary gesture at a time. But normalcy has a way of collapsing under memory. Around noon, my phone buzzed, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet of the room. It was a message from Mark. "Mom, call me when you get this. We're worried. Where are you?" A second message followed. "Please don't do anything rash. We can talk." And then a third from Jenna, all sugar and poison. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Let's clear things up before it gets complicated." I stared at the screen until it went dark. The anxiety that tried to rise in me was familiar. The old reflex to explain myself, to soothe, to make things easier for others. I felt it flare and then burn out. I set the phone face down on the table. I wasn't missing. I was unfindable, and that difference mattered. That afternoon, I walked to the public library. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks clean and shining. Inside, the smell of old paper greeted me like an old friend. I found a seat near the back and wrote in my notebook for the first time in years. Not a diary entry, no, something more precise. I began writing everything that had happened in the past few months. The small manipulations, the overheard conversations, the forms they'd tried to make me sign, the morning in the kitchen. I wrote it all down as if I were both witness and archivist, determined that even if my voice failed someday, the record wouldn't. My handwriting was slow but deliberate. When I finished, I felt lighter again, as if by transferring the story to paper, I had pulled it out of my bloodstream. On the way back to the apartment, I stopped by a hardware store and bought a new padlock. The old nurse downstairs probably wouldn't approve, but I needed that gesture, the ritual of securing my boundary with my own hands. I fixed it myself that evening, the small click of the lock echoing through the room like applause. For dinner, I made a simple soup and ate it by the window, watching the lights in the grocery store below go out one by one. I thought of Arturo then, his patient silence, the way he used to rest his palm on the table as if steadying the entire world. "You always wanted control," he once told me, half admiring, half worried. I had laughed and said, "I just don't like being managed." Now I finally understood what he'd meant. Control isn't about dominance, it's about dignity. The days began to form a rhythm after that. I called the lawyer again, arranged for the final version of my will to be notarized, updated the beneficiary to a scholarship fund instead of my son, and transferred a small amount into a separate account to cover future rent. Each action was small, quiet, almost invisible, but together they built a scaffolding around me strong enough to hold back panic. Still, a part of me remained raw, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door, the confrontation I knew would come. It didn't take long. 3 days later, as I was returning from the market with a bag of oranges, I saw Mark standing outside the building. His car, a silver one he'd bought last year, was parked badly across 2 spaces. He spotted me before I could decide whether to turn around. "Mom," he said, walking quickly toward me. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice carried both relief and accusation. I handed the grocer's bag to my other hand. Shopping, I said. You found me quickly. Of course I did, he said. You left everything. Jenna's been losing her mind. Then she has company, I said. Why are you doing this? You scared us. I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the child I'd raised, but a man who had grown accustomed to control disguised as care. I'm not doing anything, I said. I'm living. He glanced toward the building, noting the modest entrance, the narrow staircase visible through the glass. You can't stay here, he said. It's not safe. You don't even know these people. I know enough, I said. They don't lie to me about my bank account. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. You closed it, didn't you? The anger beneath his restraint vibrated like a wire about to snap. You took it all out. I withdrew what was mine, I said. That's not theft. You don't understand the consequences, he said, running a hand through his hair. You could mess up the estate, the taxes. Jesus, Mom, this is insane. It's sanity, I said quietly. You just don't recognize it. He opened his mouth again, then stopped. The traffic moved behind him, horns blaring, the world refusing to pause for our little war. Finally, he said, Come home. Please. We'll talk. We'll fix this. There's nothing to fix, I said. You made your intentions clear. I'm simply adjusting accordingly. For a moment I saw the boy he once was, the one who used to bring me wildflowers and apologize for spilling juice on the couch. That boy was gone, replaced by this man who spoke to me like a stubborn client. You're being dramatic, he said finally. I'm being deliberate, I corrected. There's a difference. He exhaled sharply and stepped back. Fine, he said. If you want to throw everything away, that's on you. He turned and walked toward the car. I didn't move until he drove off. Only then did I notice my hands trembling slightly, the oranges shifting in the bag, one rolling onto the sidewalk. I bent down to pick it up and felt an odd calm settle over me, the kind that follows an irreversible truth. He would never see me the same way again. But then, neither would I. That evening, I sat at the window again, the room dim except for the small lamp beside the chair. I thought about the encounter and what it had shifted in me. Before that moment, some part of me had still been hoping for understanding, for recognition of the wound. But as I watched the headlights move across the wall, I realized that what I needed wasn't apology, but distance. The betrayal had already taken its toll. Forgiveness would only bind me again. I reached for my notebook and wrote a single sentence on the next page. Freedom begins when explanation ends. Then I closed it, turned off the light, and let the quiet finally feel like peace. The days that followed were heavy with a strange expectancy, as though the air around me had thickened into something that both protected and warned. I kept to my quiet routines: morning coffee, walks to the market, afternoons at the library. But underneath every ordinary act ran a current of vigilance. Freedom, I was discovering, is not peace at first. It is a noise that your nerves must learn to bear. I no longer jumped at every sound from the hallway, yet my body remained alert, sensing that the story between me and my son had not finished twisting itself into its final shape. I felt it most at night, when the building settled and the refrigerator hummed like a distant insect. In those hours, my mind replayed the confrontation outside the grocery store, his eyes a mix of fury and pleading, his hand trembling not from love but from loss of control. There are moments when motherhood feels like a rope you're holding, while someone else decides whether to climb or pull. I had finally loosened my grip, and he didn't yet know how to stand without it. A week passed before the next contact came. It was a letter, delivered by hand rather than mail, slipped under my door while I was out buying milk. The envelope was heavy, the handwriting unfamiliar, neither Mark's nor Jenna's. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper bearing the letterhead of a local law firm. The language was courteous, professional, and absolutely chilling. It said they represented my son and his wife in matters concerning my financial well-being and cognitive assessment. There was mention of temporary guardianship and preventative fiduciary measures, words that dressed theft in silk. I read it 3 times, then placed it flat on the table as though it were radioactive. My first instinct was disbelief, followed by a wave of exhaustion so deep it felt ancestral. This was how they would do it, not with confrontation, but with paperwork, with the slow machinery of polite invasion. I made tea, drank it slowly, and then called my lawyer. He listened in silence as I read him the letter. "This is intimidation," he said finally. "They don't have grounds for guardianship unless they can prove mental incompetence." His calmness steadied me. "Can they try?" I asked. "They can always try," he said. "But we can respond." He advised me to gather documentation of my transactions, proof of rent payments, the bank statement from the new account, any written correspondence that showed coherence and intent. "You'll want to establish a paper trail of sanity," he said with a grim humor that made me like him even more. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat for a long time, staring at the letter until the words blurred. The betrayal had found its next form: bureaucratic love. I spent the next 2 days assembling the evidence of my competence. It felt absurd to prove to strangers that I knew who I was, that I could add, sign, decide. Every receipt, every check stub, every note from the landlord became a line of defense. When I finished, I placed everything neatly in a folder and labeled it autonomy. The act itself felt ceremonial. I even photocopied my driver's license and tucked it inside, as though identity required witnesses. At night, I dreamed of pens scratching paper, of my own name written by someone else's hand. The call from Jenna came on the 3rd evening. Her voice was syrupy at first, the way one talks to an elderly neighbor whose cat has gone missing. "Mom," she began, "we just want to make sure you're okay. We didn't mean for things to get out of hand." I said nothing. "Mark's been really upset," she continued. "He's worried someone might be taking advantage of you. You know how many scams target seniors these days." Her voice trembled on the word seniors, as if she'd bitten something sour. "I'm the only scam I've encountered lately," I said finally, "and it came with my son's last name." There was a pause long enough for me to hear her swallow. "That's not fair," she said. "We've always taken care of you." "Exactly," I said. "And now you won't have to." Her tone sharpened. "You're being unreasonable. We just want to make sure your finances are secure." "They are," I said. "From you?" That ended the conversation. I turned off the phone and set it on the counter like an artifact from another life. The following morning, I received a knock on the door. It was Ava, my landlord, holding a clipboard. "There were some people here asking about you yesterday," she said. "Said they were family. I told them you weren't home." Her eyes searched mine for explanation. "Thank you," I said. "They shouldn't be bothering you." "I'll handle it," she nodded slowly. "Families," she said, the word carrying a lifetime of unsaid things. They're the best and the worst of what we survive. After she left, I locked the door and sat on the floor, back against the bed, feeling the tremor of anger move through me. Anger, when it's clean, doesn't consume. It clarifies. I wasn't frightened anymore. I was insulted. That afternoon, I went to the bank where I'd opened my new account. The manager, a woman near my age with silver hair, cut blunt at the chin, listened attentively as I explained what was happening. "You did the right thing," she said. "Would you like to add a note to your file restricting access?" "Yes," I said. "If anyone claiming to be a family member contacts you about my finances, I want a record of refusal." She typed briskly, her nails clacking on the keyboard like punctuation marks of solidarity. "Done," she said. "And don't worry, families aren't automatically trustworthy here. We've seen it all." When I left the bank, the air felt warmer, the sky impossibly blue. I hadn't realized how deeply relief could resemble victory. But the real confrontation arrived a week later, not with papers or lawyers, but in person. I had just returned from the library, arms full of borrowed novels, when I saw Mark waiting by the entrance of my building again. He looked different, tired, unshaven, dressed in the kind of expensive casualness that screams desperation. "Mom," he said, blocking the door as I tried to pass. "Please, can we talk?" I sighed, holding the books closer to my chest. "We already have." "No," he said. "You walked away before I could explain." "Explain what? That you tried to have me declared incompetent?" "It's not like that," he said, voice cracking slightly. "The lawyer said it was just precautionary." "You've been acting erratic. Closing accounts, disappearing, avoiding us. What were we supposed to think?" "That I was tired of being handled like a defective appliance," I said. He flinched. "You're twisting everything," he said. "We only want what's best for you." "Then leave me alone," I said, stepping closer, my voice low but sharp. "That's what's best for me." He grabbed my arm, not violently, but with the urgency of someone who still believes he has the right to touch. "Mom, please. You don't understand. Jenna's pregnant again. Things are tight. We were counting on—" He stopped, realizing too late that truth had slipped out ahead of his caution. "You were counting on me," I finished. "On my silence. On my money. On my guilt." I pulled my arm free. His face went pale, then red. "That's not fair," he said weakly. "Fair," I repeated. That's a word people use when they're losing something they never should have had. For a moment, we just stood there, the city moving indifferently around us. Finally, he said, "You're really not coming back, are you?" "No," I said. "And you should stop trying to make me." His eyes filled, not with tears exactly, but with the panic of a man realizing that manipulation has limits. "You're making a mistake," he whispered. "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." I opened the door, stepped inside and closed it behind me, turning the lock with deliberate slowness. On the other side, I heard him exhale, then the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall. That night, I couldn't sleep. The encounter had stirred something I hadn't expected. Not regret, but grief for the version of motherhood that had died in me. I sat by the window again, watching the city lights tremble through the rain, and thought of all the years spent smoothing over Mark's fears, cushioning his failures, apologizing for my boundaries. Motherhood had been my first language. Silence, my second. Now I was learning fluency in distance. Around midnight, unable to bear the restlessness, I took out my notebook and began to write him a letter. I didn't intend to send it. It was for me. "My dear son," I began, "you think this is about money. It isn't. It's about memory, mine and yours, and what happens when one of us tries to erase the other's version. I remember who I was before you learned to doubt me. I remember the woman who earned every dollar you now call inheritance. And I remember the day you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an account. That's the day I stopped being your safety net and started being your mirror." When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it inside the notebook. The rain had stopped, and the first hint of dawn pressed against the curtains. I realized then that the worst part of betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the repetition, the way the betrayer keeps returning to test whether your no still means no. Each visit, each letter, each phone call is a new rehearsal of the same wound. I decided that morning to end the performance. The next day, I called my lawyer again and told him to file a restraining notice, minimal but formal. He agreed, assuring me it would discourage further attempts at contact. "You're setting a boundary," he said. "That's a good thing." But it didn't feel good. It felt necessary, like closing a door in a burning house. A week later, I received confirmation that the notice had been delivered. I imagined Mark reading it, imagined the anger and disbelief, the conversations he and Jenna would have about my ingratitude. Yet beneath their outrage I knew would be fear, the dawning realization that the woman they had underestimated had become, once again, unpredictable. In the days that followed, I began to reclaim small pleasures. The weight of a library book in my lap, the sound of the kettle whistling, the quiet satisfaction of choosing what to cook without anyone hovering. One afternoon, while waiting in line at the post office, I saw an elderly woman arguing with a clerk about a misplaced pension check. The clerk was dismissive, tapping his pen impatiently, and the woman's voice trembled between apology and fury. I stepped forward and said, "She's right. Check the back file." The clerk looked annoyed, but complied. 2 minutes later, the missing envelope appeared. The woman turned to me, astonished, then grateful. "How did you know?" she asked. "Because they always think we're mistaken," I said, "and we rarely are." She smiled, and something in that exchange settled in me. A recognition, a passing of invisible knowledge. That night, as I sat in my apartment with the window open to the summer air, I felt an unfamiliar quietness. Not the fearful kind, but the earned kind. The stillness that comes when the storm has moved on, but the furniture is still standing. I thought of Mark somewhere in his large, echoing house, perhaps holding his newborn, perhaps already rewriting the story in which I was the unstable one, the difficult mother who'd lost her mind. Let him. Every lie needs an audience. And I had left the theater. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sound of the city fold around me. The world hadn't changed, but I had, and that was enough. It happened on a Thursday, one of those bland afternoons that begin without warning or omen, the sort of day when life pretends to be still so it can rearrange itself beneath you. I had gone to the market earlier for eggs and apples, exchanged the usual polite words with the shopkeeper, and returned home thinking about nothing more than dinner. There was a letter waiting in the mailbox, thicker than the usual bills, bearing the same firm's name that had sent the guardianship notice weeks before. My hands didn't shake when I opened it, but my breath stalled in my chest as my eyes ran over the words. It was a formal motion filed in court. Mark had gone through with it. He and Jenna were requesting an emergency review of my capacity to manage financial matters, claiming they feared I was being manipulated by outsiders. They had attached evidence of erratic behavior, including the withdrawal of my savings and my sudden change of address. There were even printouts of text messages I hadn't answered, presented as proof of instability. The hearing date was set for the following Tuesday. My name, my age, my life, listed there in bureaucratic black ink, footnoted with suspicion. I sat at the table staring at the document, feeling both insulted and oddly calm. It was one thing to be betrayed in whispers, another to see it notarized. When I called my lawyer, his voice was measured, almost gentle. "We'll fight it," he said. "This happens more than you think. Adult children panic when they lose control. The courts usually see through it. But I knew better than to rely on the mercy of strangers in suits. I wanted my defense to come from my own hand. "I'll be ready," I told him. That night I stayed up until 2, drafting my statement. I didn't fill it with outrage or accusations. I filled it with facts, each one a thread in the tapestry of my sanity. The dates of my transactions, the receipts, the bank correspondence, the notarized will. I included a line near the end that I underlined twice. To love someone does not mean to surrender evidence of your existence. When I finished, I reread it aloud to the empty room. My voice sounded steadier than it had in years. I slept for only a few hours, but when I woke, I knew exactly what I would do. The morning of the hearing was clear and dry. I wore the navy dress I'd bought decades ago for Arturo's promotion dinner, the one I hadn't worn since his funeral. It still fit, though the fabric had softened with time. I pinned my hair up, applied a little lipstick, and placed the folder labeled Autonomy in my bag. On the way out, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. There was no trace of the frightened woman who had overheard her own son plotting in her kitchen. There was someone else now, someone deliberate. I took the bus downtown. The courthouse loomed like a patient machine waiting to consume and release. Inside, the smell of paper and disinfectant clung to the air. My lawyer met me near the elevators. "You don't have to speak," he reminded me. "I can handle the presentation." "No," I said. "They silenced me once. I'll speak." The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Pale walls, wooden benches, a clock that ticked too loudly. Mark and Jenna sat at the opposite table, both dressed as if for a photo shoot in respectability. Mark in a gray suit, Jenna in muted beige, her hair coiled neatly. She offered a small nod when our eyes met, the kind of nod you give a stranger whose pain you intend to explain away. Mark looked thinner, his face lined with exhaustion or guilt. I couldn't tell which. When the judge entered, everyone stood and the ritual began. Their lawyer spoke first, smooth and confident, describing a narrative of concern and filial duty. "Mr. Calderon and his wife have noticed a pattern of erratic financial behavior," he said. "They fear that Mrs. Calderon is vulnerable to exploitation, given her advanced age and recent isolation." I almost smiled at the phrase, advanced age, as if years automatically corrode reason. He presented their exhibits, bank statements, screenshots of unanswered texts, a list of supposed uncharacteristic purchases that amounted to groceries and rent. "They seek only to ensure her safety," he concluded, "and to prevent potential exploitation by predatory parties." My lawyer rose next. His defense was calm, precise. He outlined the timeline, the withdrawal done lawfully, the establishment of a new account, the notarized will, the receipts, the rent contract, the clarity of my correspondence. Mrs. Calderon is competent, he said. She is deliberate, articulate, and financially independent. What she is not is compliant. And that, unfortunately, is what her son mistakes for confusion. I felt the courtroom shift slightly, an invisible lean of sympathy. Then he gestured toward me. She would like to make a brief statement. I stood. My legs did not tremble. The judge, a woman not much younger than me, inclined her head. Proceed, Mrs. Calderon. I looked at Mark and Jenna, then at the paper in my hands, and decided not to read from it. Your Honor, I said, for most of my life I was someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's employee. Every decision I made fit inside what was expected of those titles. I saved, I worked, I took care of others. When my husband died, I kept doing what I'd always done: saving, managing, surviving. My son believes that because I no longer wish to fund his mistakes, I must be unwell. He forgets that I earned the right to decide where my comfort ends and my boundaries begin. If independence at 79 is considered instability, then I am proudly unstable. There was a soft murmur from the back of the room, quickly silenced. I love my son, I continued, but love is not ownership. It's time he learns that. When I finished, the judge thanked me and turned to Mark's lawyer, asking for evidence of any cognitive assessment. There was none. She nodded slowly, made notes, and then, after a brief recess, returned with her decision. The motion was denied. The court recognized my full legal competence and dismissed all claims of incapacity. The gavel struck once, a sound both sharp and merciful. It was over. Mark stared straight ahead, his face frozen in disbelief. Jenna whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. As I gathered my papers, I felt his eyes on me. He stood, hesitated, and then walked over. Mom, he said quietly, you didn't have to humiliate me. I looked up at him and saw, for the first time, not my son, but a man still learning what consequence meant. You did that yourself, I said. I simply told the truth. Jenna joined him, her voice low, imploring. Can't we just move past this? It's gotten so ugly. I turned to her. It was ugly long before the paperwork, I said. You just hid it under courtesy. Then I walked out. The hallway outside the courtroom was bright, the sunlight slicing through high windows like a benediction. My lawyer congratulated me, promised to send copies of the order, and offered to call me a cab. I declined. I wanted to walk. The city felt different under my feet. Lighter, cleaner, less cruel. I passed cafes and flower stands, people in suits rushing to their own dramas, none of them knowing that a 79-year-old woman had just won a quiet war inside a courthouse. I stopped at a bench and sat, letting the weight of the folder rest in my lap. I opened it and looked at the top page. Calderon v. Calderon. Petition for guardianship. Dismissed. The word glowed in the sunlight. I traced it with my finger, not out of vanity, but gratitude. When I finally reached home, the apartment welcomed me like an ally. I placed the folder on the table, brewed a cup of tea, and stood by the window. The city beyond was the same as ever, indifferent, alive, but I felt an intimacy with it I hadn't felt in years. Somewhere in another house, my son was nursing his pride, explaining to his wife and his friends how it had all been a misunderstanding. Let him. Truth, once spoken aloud, doesn't need an audience to keep living. I took a sip of tea and felt its warmth travel down, steady and sure. Then, almost without thinking, I took out the envelope of cash still hidden in the cookie tin, unfolded it, and began dividing the bills into smaller stacks. Tomorrow, I would take them to the bank and deposit them properly under my name. But tonight, I wanted to see them spread before me. Proof of labor, proof of life, proof that the woman they'd tried to erase still had weight in the world. As dusk fell, I turned on the lamp and began to write another letter. Not to Mark this time, but to my granddaughter. I told her that money is not the measure of love, that people will try to disguise control as care, that silence is the most expensive thing you can give away. I told her that when she grows older and someone says, "Don't worry, we'll take care of it for you," she must listen for the hum beneath those words and decide for herself whether it's comfort or a cage. When I finished, I signed it simply, Grandma, folded it carefully, and sealed it in an envelope for a future I might not see. Later, as I lay in bed, I thought about Arturo. I imagined him sitting on the edge of the mattress, smiling the way he used to when I finally fixed something on my own. "You did it," I could almost hear him say. And I would answer, "Yes, but not for revenge, for clarity." Outside, the streetlight flickered once and then steadied, casting a gentle glow across the room. I closed my eyes and let the quiet surround me. A silence not of absence, but of arrival. The sound of a life reclaimed. The morning after the hearing, I woke before sunrise. Not from restlessness, but from a peculiar calm that seemed to rise out of the walls themselves. The apartment was cool and silent, the city outside still half asleep, its noises distant and unhurried. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the faint line of dawn gather over the rooftops, that thin stripe of silver that always reminds me of forgiveness, the quiet, unannounced kind that doesn't come from others, but from the self. Finally, unclenching. My body felt heavier, yes, but it was the good kind of heaviness, like a coat that fits again after years of hanging forgotten in a closet. I had been waiting for this feeling without knowing it. The sensation of life rearranging itself around truth. The hearing hadn't made me victorious. It had made me visible again, even to myself. For years, I'd been living in the shadow of my own good intentions, letting politeness swallow every protest, letting maternal guilt disguise itself as patience. Now the air was thin, the room bare, and for the first time in decades, I could hear my own breathing without the echo of someone else's demands. Later that morning, I took a slow walk to the harbor, carrying the letter I had written to my granddaughter. The sky was pale and wide, and the water reflected it with that fragile brightness that only happens early in the day before the world's noise thickens. The pier smelled of salt and old wood, familiar scents that pulled memory and time into one continuous thread. I found an empty bench near the railing and sat down. A group of fishermen were already there, speaking in low voices, their words swallowed by the wind. One of them nodded at me, and I nodded back, content in the language of silent acknowledgement. I took the letter out of my purse and read it once more, slowly, not to revise, but to remember what it felt like to write it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from weakness, but from the breeze rising off the water. When I finished reading, I folded it carefully again and tucked it into a small envelope, addressed simply to her name, nothing more. I would mail it later that day, not because I expected a reply, but because some truths belong to the next generation before they belong to closure. I stayed there a long time, watching the gulls lift and settle, their wings carving slow arcs through the air. The harbor was waking. The sounds of cranes, the creak of ropes, the steady hum of engines somewhere beyond sight. Everything moved with purpose but without rush. I thought about the years when I believed purpose required noise, that to matter one had to be in motion, solving, fixing, anticipating the needs of others. Now I understood that stillness can be its own form of action, that sitting quietly while the tide turns is sometimes the bravest thing a person can do. I had been a caretaker all my life of people, of routines, of peace that never truly was mine. And now, at 79, I had become the caretaker of my own name. That was enough. Around noon, I walked to the post office and mailed the letter. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if I wanted tracking, and I said no. Some things are meant to travel unobserved. From there, I went to a small cafe, the one with chipped tables and the smell of roasted beans that seeps into your clothes. The same young barista who had once looked at me with polite condescension now greeted me like a regular. "The usual?" he asked, and I smiled. Not because I'd been here often, but because being remembered in any small way felt like a quiet victory. I sat near the window again, sipping my coffee, watching people hurry along the street with their bags and schedules and small urgencies. I realized, not with sadness, but with clarity, that none of them knew who I was or what I had survived. And yet, in some ineffable way, they were all part of the proof that life continues, indifferent, generous, and infinite. When I returned home, the afternoon light filled the apartment like honey, thick and golden, touching every surface as if blessing it. I opened the window and let the air in, listening to the faint chorus of the city, a dog barking, a door closing, the rumble of a bus. On the table lay the folder from the court, the envelope of money now replaced by deposit slips, the small traces of order I had built for myself. I didn't need to look at them again. Their mere presence was enough. I went to the bookshelf, which was little more than 2 wooden planks balanced on bricks, and arranged the library books I had borrowed, stories of women who had outlived their usefulness only to find, like me, that usefulness is a word invented by those afraid of solitude. I chose one at random and began to read, not for escape but for companionship. The words were slow, steady, carrying the rhythm of another woman's breath across time. When I closed it an hour later, the light had shifted to that pale amber that signals the approach of evening. As I prepared dinner, a small bowl of soup, some bread, a slice of apple, I thought about Mark again, but the thought no longer burned. I imagined him in his kitchen, perhaps speaking softly to his new baby, perhaps glancing toward his phone, tempted to call, restrained by pride. I wished him well, truly. I had no appetite for bitterness. If I were to speak to him again someday, it would not be from anger but from equilibrium, the kind that comes when love is no longer currency. I had given him everything I could, years, patience, second chances, and now the remainder belonged to me. That too was a kind of inheritance. After dinner, I walked once more to the harbor. The sun was lowering itself behind the cranes, the water turning bronze. Couples strolled by, their laughter trailing behind them like ribbons, and I let it pass through me without envy. The bench I'd sat on that morning was empty again. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and breathed in the faint salt air. Somewhere a bell rang from a distant buoy, its sound soft and rhythmic, like the echo of a heartbeat that refused to fade. I thought of Arturo, of the life we had built out of long days and small certainties, and whispered his name once into the wind. It carried the sound away, not cruelly, but gently, as if returning it to the sea. The sky darkened slowly, that deep blue that comes just before true night, and I felt the first coolness touch my skin. I stayed until the streetlights blinked on, their reflections trembling on the surface of the water. Then I rose, adjusted my scarf, and began to walk home. The streets were quiet, the windows glowing with other people's evenings. I passed by one where a woman about my age sat reading, a lamp beside her, her expression peaceful. Our eyes met for a second through the glass, and we both smiled, an acknowledgement, not of recognition, but of kinship. At my door, I paused and looked up at the narrow slice of moon. It looked like something being mended, a fragment promising wholeness. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water, turned off the lights, and stood in the soft dark. I thought of everything that had been taken, everything that had been returned, and how, in the end, survival is not a triumph shouted from rooftops, but a quiet persistence, a daily choosing. I had chosen myself, not perfectly, not early enough, but finally. And that, I realized as I lay down, was the entire story, the kind of ending that doesn't close, only steadies. Before sleep came, I whispered one last thought into the room, not to Arturo, not to Mark, but to the unseen listener. I imagined somewhere in the future, another woman with trembling hands at her own kitchen sink. Don't wait for permission to keep what's yours. They will call you selfish. Let them. There is no shame in being your own safe place. Then I closed my eyes, and the silence folded around me like a blanket, warm, absolute, and deserved.